This podcast is a project of the USAID Asia Counter Trafficking in Persons Project, brought to you by the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Welcome to Labor of Loss, a podcast series about human trafficking across Asia. I'm Tara Kamal-Navith, a Bangkok-based journalist and producer. Over the course of this series, we've put human trafficking and forced labor under the microscope, one industry at a time. We followed Ari, who spent months at sea facing abuse and poor conditions to put fish on our tables. We stepped inside Malaysia's palm oil plantations and discovered how the industry was forged in the legacy of the British Empire. Speaking with domestic workers and brick kiln laborers and women who were forced into marriages, we witnessed a range of exploitative practices. This episode, we're doing something different. We're zooming out and looking at the big picture. Speaking to all the guests in the series, it strikes me that there are some common themes across industries and geographies. Passport retention, brokers' fees, the ability for workers to organize, their marginalized position due to their visa status. We've heard about all these problems in every episode, in every place and type of work. Putting out spot fires may not be enough. So I wanted to ask a panel made up of the brightest minds. What are the systematic issues driving human trafficking and forced labor? And what are the best ways to respond? Joining me for a panel discussion from Hong Kong.
Hi everyone, my name is Archana Kotecha. I'm the CEO and founder of the Remedy Project, which is a Hong Kong-based social enterprise. We work across Southeast Asia and our work focuses on remedial solutions across global supply chains with particular focus on Southeast Asia.
From Nepal.
Namaste, I'm Bijaya Rai Shrestha, founder, chair, and now an executive director of Amkash Nepal. We ourselves are all returning migrants. I myself is a returning migrant worker. We worked abroad, came back, united ourselves, and started working on our own issue.
From the UK.
My name is Mustafa Qadri. I'm the founder and executive director of Equidem, which is a human rights and labour rights organisation, and we work a lot on the human rights impacts on low-wage workers and migrant workers in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East.
I started by asking the panel about the common trends they see across the region and what they believe is driving human trafficking.
There's lots of drivers for human trafficking and modern slavery. I think a few that I'd like to focus on are firstly the fact that what you've got is people in situations and countries in the world where there are a range of issues around basically poverty and lack of opportunity that lead them to seek work either in a different region of their country or overseas. And so what that means is that there's a real demand for work overseas. And what that then does is create an inherent vulnerability to being exploited. Now, what that doesn't mean is that people necessarily choose to suffer, but that when they're so desperate to find work and there's a lack of development in their areas. So, for example, when it comes to low-wage migrant workers going to Southeast Asia from South Asia or going to the Gulf from South Asia, that sets the stage for being exposed to human trafficking and forced labour, those sorts of things. Now, on top of that, then, is people are willing to then charge these people for their employment, for their recruitment. And that is an environment that's poorly or not regulated at all by governments, meaning that either there are laws there that prohibit that, but governments don't actually adequately enforce those laws. So both the state, the government, as well as these recruiters and the business community are very much able to exploit these people because firstly, there's money to be made. They can charge them for their work. And let that really sink in. The idea that someone who's going to be doing a very essential but low-paid job, like a cleaner, construction worker working in a hospital, that person is themselves paying for their job. So that automatically means that they're under some kind of financial debt or burden that makes them less likely to complain about the situation. So obviously there are other factors, but those to me are some critical issues that set the stage for that risk of human trafficking, forced labour, modern slavery.
I mean, I was just going to say, in addition to the economic disparity and lack of opportunity highlighted by Mustafa, I think there's an inherently discriminatory attitude towards migrant workers. And this is very much reflected in legal frameworks globally. If you look at the way systems are built and visa regimes are built to actually hire low-skilled workers, they in themselves create a separate category of people who have very secondary rights. When it comes to legal frameworks, if you just think about, the TITP system in Japan, the kafala, there are so many others around the world where workers are given a different set of rights, and there are so many opportunities for contract substitution, recruitment fees, passport retention, visa renewal processes that are governed by or led by the employer, and which make the workers infinitely vulnerable to exploitation. The legal frameworks that are there to supposedly protect the rights of these individuals let them down as well.
Our issue in Nepal is now the ban, the discriminatory ban that the government has imposed and has been imposing since 1998. The ban means in 1998 there was a case of a migrant worker, Nepali women migrant worker, who had a mistress death in Kuwait. So, and our government thought that, women should be protected. And they just put a ban for women migrant workers to go to Gulf countries, especially to the Gulf countries and even Malaysia to work. Because, the government thinks that women are vulnerable. So they think that they are trying to protect women. But it is causing them more, problems. Because of the ban, women are forced to migrate through illegal channel. And when they reach the destination country, they are working as undocumented workers, which makes them more vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation. Saying that ban is never a solution, it makes women more vulnerable. It makes, the traffickers, the agents, local agents more active.
You guys all do such important work in the human trafficking space, and I find it so interesting that you focus your efforts on very different directions. In your view, what do you think is the single most important issue to be addressed to effectively reduce human trafficking in this region?
I think, from my perspective, it would have to be addressing economic disparity and the creation of opportunities for people so that migration is a choice, not a necessity. And therefore, the sort of the being compelled to leave your family behind, to travel somewhere else, to be in a foreign country where you don't understand the laws, perhaps you don't understand the language, and worst of all, you have to pay to get a low-skilled job and leave your country indebted, becoming extremely vulnerable in the country of destination. If these opportunities or more opportunities could be available at home, then it takes away the necessity so that people who do want to go are able to go by choice. And economic possibilities also mean that recognizing the contribution of workers in the informal sector who are often invisible and very, very poorly protected, recognizing the worth of, temporary or seasonal workers, again, who seem to disappear and blend into, a black hole. And recognizing women as economic actors, because many women are so active in informal sectors and their contribution is never recognized, and recognizing their role not just as, women workers, but also as women who lead families, who raise children, and who have multiple roles to play in communities. So I think addressing the economic, underlying economics of it would be really important.
Definitely, because in Nepal also, those women who are most vulnerable are going as domestic workers. Because of lack of dignity of work, women are migrating. Dignity of work is very important. And of course, creating job opportunities, as Archana has mentioned, if we create opportunities, migration can be a choice, not a forced migration, which leads to trafficking. They have the right to mobility. But if someone wants to migrate for a job, government has to play a big role. Skill trainings, give them language trainings. The pre-departure orientation should be very effective. So our government should address the economic empowerment, which we, civil societies, are trying to work with the government. support our government in the economic empowerment activities.
Archana and Vijaya have really eloquently and thoughtfully answered the question. I think if you look at it from a bigger perspective, a big part of what we're seeing is basically a system where workers are being forced to pay for their own employment, recruitment, and that basically is a form of subsidy to the employer and to the businesses whose value chains they will enter. And whether those workers are formally employed or informal, a huge bulk of those workers are ultimately working for very large, to generate profit for very large companies or state enterprises. And so this is something that leads to then a relatively stable, if highly chaotic, profit-making venture. And I think that's fundamentally what's driving it. I mean, there's lots of other factors too, but that's fundamentally driving it. So yes, there's the desperation, there's a lack of employment, but there's also money being made out of this suffering. And so that's what you have to break. How do you break that? Very difficult. I think firstly, there is the strategy of acknowledging that labour migration is a reality, and it has been for all of human civilization. So even if there are more jobs being created, even if there's more dignity provided in jobs back home, people will still migrate. Therefore, that process needs to be adequately regulated. But the longer term thing, I think personally, is that having less people travelling abroad and building up the economies, the societies where they come from, and particularly the regions where they come from. So, for example, in India or China, you have whole generations of children growing up without their parents because their parents can't find work in their regions, and so they travel to other areas. Those regions need to be built up. You have children themselves working because of, although they're not migrating necessarily, but because there's no opportunities for them to get education or for their parents to get work. So there's a whole flow and effect. I think one other thing to really stress is collective action, worker organising. The fact is that generally trade unionism is in decline globally, but particularly with low-wage workers and migrant workers, they're not unionised. They don't have the ability to exercise their freedom of association rights. In many of the countries where they travel to, like say Malaysia or the Gulf, it's prohibited. It's a criminal offence in many of these countries to even do some kind of basic organising. And I think that is a huge impediment as well. There needs to be efforts done to promote that, because that is really essential. How do we get the workers, the women and men themselves, to be the ones that are driving those solutions, and therefore we support those people?
Question for Vijaya. Looking at returned workers, which many of them have been exploited, what kind of support do they want the most? What sort of services are failing the victims?
The first thing is that, most of our women migrant workers comes from the remote area. And when they land at the airport, they don't have anywhere to go. So the first thing is that our governments, they have failed to really establish shelters, spaces for women migrant workers. And like civil societies like us, we run a shelter. We give them accommodation, free accommodation, and even we give them free basic medical supports, psychosocial counseling, and even there are so many women coming back with medical problems like pregnancy, which coming back with child, and some of them come with very critical mental problems. So these kind of things our government is still failing. And especially I want to talk about the COVID. Our government was not at all prepared to receive migrant workers. Civil societies were very active, and especially our organization, we were very active. So we rented a hotel and we accommodated, we supported, we give services to more than 200 distressed women migrant workers in the hotel. At this point also, I would like to say that our government has failed this.
So in terms of the government, Vijaya has talked a little bit about it. What can the government realistically do to address and reduce forced labor?
Yeah, I mean, I can quickly jump in. I think there's a lot that government can do. I would say one very practical thing is that allowing workers to be able to vote in elections, even when they're overseas, is really important. I mean, it happens with some countries, and I think that's led directly to an improvement in their governments actually caring about the welfare of their citizens. And the second thing is trade unionism. They're creating some kind of collective power amongst workers. So, I mean, there's lots of things government can do. There's also support that they might need. But ultimately, what's going to make the government and the forces behind the government want to make those changes, that's going to be political pressure. So it's around, being able to vote in elections and giving an incentive to political parties to therefore care about migrant workers, but also organising workers so that they can put pressure as citizens on their governments to do something about their situation.
I mean, Tara, if I can just add to what Mustafa just said, I think there are two concrete things that come up that governments can pressurize and create. And one is a climate of transparency, and the second is a climate of accountability. There needs to be accountability. There have to be consequences for not delivering. But all of these are premised on the fact that there has to be a degree of enforcement for any of this to be valid. And what we see, for example, in the work that I do on a daily basis is the legal frameworks are there. We have enough to use, but actually we don't really tend to see much usage of it. And a lot of it comes down to a lack of willpower, but there's also a very strong corporate lobby. And, it's this corporate lobby that has been free pretty much to set up all the processes that it has wanted to maximize its capital and to maximize its profit. And the governments have taken a backseat in this entire process. So, we are now at a point where exploitation is really high, and it is really important for governments to step up and to really not be relying on the private sector to do things voluntarily, but rather to ensure that the right standards are in place and that these are enforced and respected and that there are consequences created for not doing the right thing. So even where, Mustafa, you talked very eloquently about trade unionism, etc., what we see is even where workers are allowed to join trade unions, they are not allowed to be part of senior management of trade unions. That inherently creates an issue of trust where the migrant workers, for example, would not consider it safe for them to join trade unions because their interests might not be best represented. So there are so many different ways in which governments can really up the ante and do a lot more.
There are so many laws being endorsed. There are so many things that happens, but it is not implemented. The implementation part is still weak. The monitoring part is still weak. And the other thing is our women migrant workers, the returning migrant workers, most of them are victims of wage theft. Now in our shelter, we have a woman who came back with not receiving salary for 4 years. She was a kind of modern, day slavery. She worked in that house and she was not allowed to go out. And finally, after 4 years, she was sent back home without a penny. At this situation, it is really a big challenge for us to, rehabilitate them, reintegrate them. The ones who are coming back with babies or in a pregnant situation because of the unwanted pregnancy, they are not able to reintegrate into their society, into their family. The family do not accept them. So we are pressurizing our government for compensation for the migrant workers who have been victims, and even we are doing a lot of family counseling, because without family counseling, the families are very reluctant to accept this kind of women.
I just wanted to quickly go back to Mustafa's point about organizing workers. How do you promote the organization of workers when there's so many barriers?
There are a couple of things to say. I think the point that was made earlier about how even when workers can join unions or participate in existing trade unions, they are somewhat marginalised is a very good point. What I think really needs to happen is reimagining trade unionism from the perspective of migrant workers, low-wage workers, informally employed workers. And I think that's a general point, not just for migrant workers, but with the casualisation of the workforce, we have to reimagine trade unionism. And so really, the first step is to look at what workers are already doing and what are their demands, what are their expectations. And what we find with our work, because in Equidem, our own staff are themselves migrant workers, is that when workers are facing problems with their employer or their situation, they go to their own worker community to seek some kind of resolution, to find some kind of support. Now, what we see at the moment is that the most effective forms of that tend to be really under the radar because they're not legally allowed to exist. but also a lot of the effort is focused on, which is very important, the humanitarian needs of workers or people that have lost their job and they're in a really bad situation of destitution. What we see less of is a rights-based approach, although it does sometimes happen. And the reason for that is actually not to be critical of workers themselves, but in a way that they've been shut out of that system. Now, that system not necessarily needs people like experts and official representatives to be functioning, but also what it leads to is effectively like another layer that is representing workers, but who are not themselves workers. And so I think that's the thing that we really need to reimagine. How do we firstly empower workers with knowledge as to their rights and how the rights-based approach works, and then also get them at the forefront of that system? I think that's a generational or multi-generational task, but I think there's things that certainly Equidem we're trying to work on. But I think those are the sorts of things that we need to work on. And it really does boil down to workers are already organising. Speak to workers. What do they want? How do they conceive of the issues? What are their expectations? Because ultimately, as I personally see it, is that we're talking about a business environment, right? That is situated. Yes, there's the legislative aspect to it, and that's the government bit. Yes, there is the social aspect to it, and there's the economic aspect. But what you fundamentally, as I see it, is the issue is that it's a system that exploits workers so that they can be subsidizing themselves to be cheap sources of workforce, labor for very large profit-making enterprises. And so that's the thing that can only be broken when workers are organizing and working collectively and saying, well, no, we expect much more than we're getting. And I think we have to think of ways of how we get workers engaged and sensitized to that kind of aspect. Because what generally happens in our experience, and it's not a criticism, I understand entirely why it happens this way, is that, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the government just decides that, or the employer decides thousands of workers are no longer needed, and they just cancel their visas. And so then thousands of workers are made destitute. And then it's really just the responsibility of those workers' countries of origin, their own governments, to repatriate them as a humanitarian issue. And then worker organising bodies will play the forefront role in evacuating or supporting those workers. And that's really essential work. But what it doesn't really address is the fundamental problems that lead to that situation. So you're sort of dealing with the humanitarian byproduct of the exploitation. You're not addressing the exploitation itself. And I think that nowadays, with things like greater sensitization, awareness, but also technology, it's increasingly less plausible to be saying, oh, I actually don't know where this worker is from, or we don't know what happens to workers when they go overseas. We need to be connecting those things together. And it goes to the point that was made earlier about transparency and accountability, exposure. In the same way that the ethical clothes movement has been really pushing for people to be aware of where do their clothes come from, how they're manufactured, who are the people behind that. It's the same kind of principle. They're the ones that we have to support and train to be themselves talking about the impacts on them and helping them to work out ways to demand the change, to be the forefront, to lead those campaigns and those movements to make the change.
I want to focus on the term human trafficking and modern slavery. Is it useful, or are there limitations to it, or are there other frameworks or other ways to approach and think about these issues?
I'll give you a lawyer's answer to this. And having been someone who's worked on cases for many years, these are labels that have become very significant in terms of what attaches to them. So you have entire systems of victim identification, victim screening, referral and support systems, indicators that are built out of this, that define the parameters of what a victim is, who is a victim, and what are the characteristics that they present. And as long as somebody fits into that category, then they can go through the criminal justice process and access remedy of some shape or form. That's a good case scenario. So what I found is that when you're building these cases, these situations are complex, and very often there is a very large gray area. And it's more realistic to think of it as a spectrum of exploitation where there are different types of exploitation and different gradations, rather than something which is starkly this or starkly that. And as a result, you find many cases of human trafficking, for example, that are being pushed through the forced labor route or vice versa, with all of those failing because they fail to meet the threshold. And essentially what happens is those who the law is designed to protect are left out of the protection of the law. In the end, you just watch people fall through the cracks and fall through the net, and it's really upsetting. So I think, it is time we question some of the labels that attach to these different offences, how we conceptualize it, how we conceptualize the world of work, labour relations, to really rethink the way these terms, often don't serve the purpose that they're supposed to.
Most of the migrant workers that we are supporting now, they are also victims of trafficking. They don't like to be called trafficked women or victims of trafficking. But when we look at the definition, so they are trafficked victims. But when we are fighting the case for trafficking victims, we don't file a case under the trafficking law because it's more, a lengthier process. And, migrants, they don't want to go under that process also. Because when they go through that process, they say that they don't have time and they think that they are not traffic victims. So they have to go through the, Foreign Employment Act. So in our work also, it is affecting the work that we are doing also.
I think there's a value in these terms because there is hard law behind them. And I think we have to leverage that to influence actors, particularly corporates, I think, but also governments, because it is about that putting pressure on them. So what do we have as our cards to pressure people, to incentivize them to do the right thing? So, if there is law or even a reputational damage from being accused or being punished with being guilty of human trafficking, forced labour, modern slavery, then we certainly have to use that. But I totally agree that, in terms of actually getting justice for victims, these systems are very broken. But the other thing also, it really essentializes people, meaning that it turns them into victims. And as Bijaya mentioned, people are, like all of us, we're proud. We don't want to be seen as a victim, right? Even if we've been abused. And there's a lot of a stigma around, being considered a victim of modern slavery or something like that. And often that language, it resonates if you're in a Western country, but doesn't really resonate in other parts of the world. So other ways of conceptualizing are really important, along with using these tools. And then that's why we're hearing things such as, you mentioned labour relations. There's also wage theft. Just the basic idea of if I work, I need to be properly compensated for that, dignity for work.
As we drew to a close, I asked the panelists for their closing thoughts and what they feel needs to be heard the most.
I hope this will be listened by friends who are working in destination countries. Women migrant workers, they are facing a lot of problems in most of the destination countries. When we need some kind of support from our partners in destination countries, I hope we can coordinate, we can connect with them to make our migration more dignified, safer and well-managed migration.
My closing bid would very much be that it would be great to see workers have a seat at the table and to be taken as serious contending stakeholders in the world of work, because essentially they are extremely marginalized right now. And I think both the private sector and the government have a very important role in ensuring that this actually happens.
I'll just add to that, just to say really briefly that, just as people are asking questions from their governments, from the companies that provide them with goods and services about their environmental impact, their social impacts, people should be thinking that not just far away, but also at home, low-wage workers and migrant workers are essential to the way that we live. And they should be asking questions of their local council, in their community about, who are the people behind the products and the services that we're completely reliant on, how are they being treated, and making sure, just as Archana and Vijaya have much more eloquently said than me, how are we giving them a voice and bringing them a seat to the table?
been listening to Archana Kotecha, Vijaya Raishrestha, and Mustafa Qadri. And that's it for our final episode of Labor of Loss. Thank you to all the guests who participated in the series. If you like this podcast or learned something new, please share it with your friends and colleagues. You can find all the episodes and more information at freedomcollaborative.org. Labor of Loss is a production of Winrock International as part of its USAID Asia CTIP program. It is hosted by me, Tara Kamal-Nabith, and produced by Nicole Kirby and Michael Green. Sound design and mixing by John Chia. Additional production by Inigo Manthagon at Noise Studio in Bangkok. Thank you to executive producer Jeannie Crump and Zara Piazzano and Natasha Burley, and to Julia from Liberty Shared. This podcast was made possible through the generous support of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. The opinions are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of USAID or Winrock International.